On Valentine's Day back in 1982, an Arizona state trooper was walking along the side of Interstate Highway 40. He was searching for the remains of a blown-out tire which had been lost during a recent traffic accident that occurred near the Monte Carlo truck stop, around 11 miles away from Williams, Arizona. As the officer continued his search, he found himself approaching a cedar tree, having spotted something half buried in the soil beneath it. But it was not a blown-out tire. Lying face down in the dirt was the lifeless body of an unidentified young woman. She had apparently been dragged around 25 feet from the nearby interstate, and lying next to the corpse was a white sweater with red stripes, a white bra, and a white handkerchief. Larger sections of the girl's face and right ear, as well as her hands and feet, had been eaten away by animals, making fingerprint identification completely impossible. Coroners later determined that the girl had been dead for around 2 weeks before she was discovered, and that the cause of death was most likely suffocation or asphyxiation, as her hyoid bone had not been broken, and there were no other significant indications of physical trauma. Since it was impossible to identify her, and in light of the date her corpse was discovered, the authorities nicknamed the girl Valentine Sally instead of the usual Jane Doe. In an effort to identify their nameless victim, police officers canvassed the surrounding area in the hopes of garnering clues. One witness claimed to have given Valentine Sally a ride after spotting her hitchhiking around Cords Junction, which is around an hour's drive away from Flagstaff, Arizona. The witness claimed that the hitchhiker's journey had started in Phoenix Valley, and that she was employed as a dishwasher at a restaurant there. She also claimed to have a family in the state of New Jersey, and that she intended on traveling there due to trouble in her home life. Her plan was to make it all the way to the Little America truck stop in Flagstaff, where she would hitch a ride further east with any truckers headed in that direction. Days later, a woman named Patty Wilkins contacted law enforcement, claiming that she'd spotted the Valentine Sally on February 4th, when she arrived at her family's truck stop in the company of a much older man. This truck stop, the Monte Carlo, was the same one Valentine Sally's body was found in the vicinity of just 10 days later. Patty claimed to have found the situation deeply suspicious and approached the girl to ask if she needed any assistance. The girl refused and seemed more than happy to remain in the trucker's company, yet complained of a very severe toothache. Patty then applied some crushed-up aspirin to the girl's tooth, a substance which was later found in the tooth cavity of Valentine Sally. Patty Wilkins was then shown pictures of the clothes found at the scene of the crime. All matched those that the mystery hitchhiker had been wearing on the day that she visited the Monte Carlo. 3 years later, Valentine Sally was falsely identified as Melody Eugenia Cutlip, who disappeared from Istachata, Florida in 1980. A forensic dentist compared the bite marks between the two women and announced that they'd found a match. The same dentist apparently reconstructed the faces of both Valentine Sally and Melody Cutlip before declaring a significant level of resemblance between the two girls. Melody's mother famously refused to believe the body belonged to her daughter, and although many claim this was the result of untamable grief, she was later vindicated when her daughter returned home during the summer of 1986. Along with their attempts to identify Valentine Sally, authorities worked tirelessly to identify the trucker she'd been spotted with just hours prior to her death. The man was described as being middle-aged, between the ages of 50 and 60 years old, and was thought to be sporting a two-toned leather vest with a checkered pattern, along with a black felt cowboy hat that had a peacock feather tucked into it. Based on a physical description given by Patty Wilkins, the police commissioned a series of composite sketches, many of which seemed to resemble Royal Russell Long, a convicted kidnapper and suspected serial killer who was given 2 life sentences in 1985 for his involvement in the abduction of 2 teenage girls. Sadly, Long has since passed away in prison, meaning if he was Valentine Sally's killer, he will never face justice for his unforgivable crimes. In 2005, the case of Valentine Sally was handed over to the Coconino County Cold Case Team, who vowed to continue the efforts of both identifying her and catching her killer. Then, in 2018, when the Golden State Killer was positively identified due to extensive forensic testing, the cold case team saw an opportunity to finally uncover the truth of Valentine Sally's identity. They reached out to Barbara Venter, the genealogist who worked on the Golden State Killer case, to help build a profile based on Valentine Sally's DNA. The team then compared Sally's DNA to that of multiple individuals throughout the area and managed to track down one of her relatives. From there, they followed bloodlines down to one particular family living in Missouri and discovered that one of their number had disappeared around 1979. This girl had a history of running away from home and had charges on her juvenile record that had never been expunged. Finally, on February 22nd of 2021, almost 40 years to the day since Sally's body was discovered, the Coconino cold case team held a very important press conference. They announced that after decades of tireless work, Valentine Sally had been officially identified as 17-year-old Carolyn Celeste Eaton of Bellefontaine Neighbors, Missouri. Apparently, the last time Carolyn and her family were together was on Christmas Day of 1981, when they discovered her in the company of two strange men. This led to a confrontation between Carolyn and her parents, and she responded by running away from home for the umpteenth time. Her parents assumed that she'd return in the usual time frame, when she either ran out of money or realized her mistake. Little did they know, they'd never see their little girl ever again. In an interview following the long-awaited identification, Patty Wilkins stated that she was haunted by Carolyn's murder and felt like she was her last, best chance of salvation. "I knew something was off," she told a journalist. "I just knew it. Even when she told me she didn't need any help, I could sense something wasn't right. But I didn't do anything. At least, I didn't do enough. And I guess that's a regret that I'll just have to learn to live with." Patty added that Carolyn and the man she was spotted with appeared to be close, almost as if they'd been friends for a while. She also stated that she wouldn't be surprised if Carolyn's killer was someone her family were aware of, and supposedly asked the reporter, "If you ever find out who did it, tell me, so I can go stamp on their toes." Carolyn Eaton was eventually given a proper burial at Mountain View Cemetery just outside the town of Williams, Arizona. She lies under a very unusual-looking headstone, one that stands in stark contrast with those around it. Instead of a dull gray slab of stone, Carolyn's marker is a large, bright red heart, which depicts the names Valentine Sally as well as Carolyn Eaton. This is to signify that no matter how long a person is missing for, no matter how long they're referred to by Jane Doe or any other morbid nickname, they will not stay that way forever.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. I'm an overnight security guard for a large building. Parking ramp is generally really a quiet job with a lot of free time. But occasionally, I do have to kick out some homeless people. It's a horrible part of the job, and I do my best to direct them to the next safest place to sleep. Most people are understanding because they unfortunately go through this a lot. If anything, they want to vent, and I tried to be an open ear. Our protocol is to ask them to leave, then if they don't, tell them to leave, and if all else fails, we have to contact the police. I've only gotten to that last step. It's important to note my general routine at work. I sit in a shack in the parking ramp for an hour. Then I go for a walk around the building and then back to the shack. The doors are all locked, but there's an entryway with an ATM that's open 24/7. This is usually where I find people looking for a place to sleep. For more context, I'm a smaller woman and unarmed. On this night, there was a woman trying to sleep by the ATM. I followed protocol, and after the first 2 warnings, I had to contact police. She yelled at me, which is out of the normal, but understandable considering her position. Must be frustrating being constantly kicked out of every semi-safe place. The police arrived, and because I was a little scared, I always am, I watched from inside the building out of view to make sure they got around. If she was yelling at me, she was full on screaming at them, and this went on for about half an hour before she left the building. Unfortunately, that's all the cops are required to do, so she made her way to the bus stop right outside. The problem with this is the bus stop is parallel with my shack. She was just sitting and staring at me with hatred in her eyes, and I got comfortable pretty quick. So I decided to take another walk. When I was passing the door that led out to my shack, I decided to take a peek out the little door window. And I don't usually do this, but I feel uneasy knowing she was probably still in the area. And it's a good thing I did. I could just barely see it, but behind my shack I saw the slightest wobble. There she was, hiding right behind my shack. It's not a big thing, maybe a 10-foot cube made out of large window and metal right at the entrance of the parking ramp. I have no doubt she is waiting for me. I called the police again and just kept watching from the little door window. And while I was waiting, she eventually let out an angry scream, kicked the miscellaneous junk in front of the shack, and stormed up the stairwell into the parking ramp for an extra kick of anxiety. The floor above me had a broken door that wasn't locked at the time. Eventually, the police got there, and after some harsh words, they got her to leave again. And this time, she walked off into the night. What really scared me was what I found on my next walk. Now there's a mirror next to the door I was watching her from. I couldn't see it from inside. But from this side, it was obvious. She had broken the mirror and a large piece was missing. Maybe I'd allow my anxiety to build all this up in my head, but from my perspective, she had taken a large sharp object hidden behind my shack and waited for me to walk up. You tell me if I'm overreacting, but to my nameless potential assailant, I wish you better times and a bed to sleep in. But I also hope I never see you again. On the morning of October 19th, 1971, Cheryl Spiegel woke up a very excited young lady. It was her 10th birthday, and although she was headed to school that morning, her family had promised her cake and presents on her return home. Obviously, she was very excited. It was her day, her special day, so it was only natural that the birthday girl got a few extra minutes in bed, especially when her regular wake-up time was around 5:30 in the morning. If this meant that Cheryl didn't depart for the school bus with her brothers as she normally did. Instead, she left the house at around 6:25 a.m., headed out into the dark, foggy fall morning all alone. It was a walk that should have just taken a few minutes tops, but Cheryl never made it to school that day. In fact, the morning of Cheryl's birthday will be the last time anyone would see her alive in the mysteries surrounding her death, with puzzle professional and amateur detectives alike for years to come. Following her missing persons report being filed, local police officers conducted interviews with classmates, neighbors, and members of the Spiegel family itself, but not a single person could provide any useful information. The streets had been all but deserted when Sherwood appeared, when local newspaper began reporting sightings of Cheryl in the surrounding area. The police focused their investigation around the possibility of her running away from home, a dire mistake at a crucial time in the investigation, as it amounted to little more than wishful thinking. Because around 2 weeks later, a milk delivery driver was out on his usual morning rounds when he found he needed to take a leak. He pulled over to the side of an isolated country road when he noticed an odd grouping of rocks in the creek bed below him. It appeared as though they'd been deliberately stacked almost like a pyramid shape. The driver's curiosity got the better of him, and he headed down the slope to further investigate the odd formation. But when he did so, he noticed a small child-sized arm visible in one of the small crevices. The flesh was hideously discolored, with its owner obviously deceased, so the horrified delivery driver rushed to call 911. Shortly afterwards, emergency services arrived at the scene, collecting the corpse, which would soon be identified as the missing Cheryl Spiegel. The birthday girl had been stabbed a total of 26 times, with some of the stab wounds so deep that they ran through her completely. However, they didn't appear to have been the result of a knife. Rather, the wounds were small and puncture-like in nature, as if she had been stabbed with a needle-like instrument. She had also been stripped completely nude, but thankfully, there was little evidence of any kind of physical violation having occurred in a horrible twist of fate. It was her older brother's 11th birthday when her father was summoned to identify her body, forcing him to bear witness to the savage, frenzied manner in which she had been killed. Cheryl was buried 2 days after her body was found on November 6, 1971. Her family held a small ceremony for her at Highland Cemetery in Fort Mitchell, Kentucky, and the search for her killer continued with the ever-pervading question: did her birthday play any significance in her abduction, or was it simply a horrible coincidence? Homicide detectives surveyed the surrounding area but didn't find much of interest. The only pertinent location was a gas station, an ATM machine at a bank, and a McDonald's had stayed open until 5 a.m. Aside from those late-night businesses, there were no reasons to be in the area at such a time. But canvassing the area came up with 4 major persons of interest, all of which were spoken to by police. The first was a man who lived across the street from the Spiegel house. According to more than one witness statement, this man would sometimes sit on the porch or in his car and watch the children, not in a wholesome way either. People say that there was something to this man's stare, something chilling in the years following Cheryl's murder. His concerning behavior continued to make his neighbors uncomfortable, even if he was eventually cleared of suspicion. Although he refused to take a polygraph test, which was highly suspicious, it turned out that he had an airtight alibi, as he had been working as a day laborer for a company in nearby Cincinnati. The second person of interest was another of Cheryl's neighbors, a drug-addicted member of a local car theft ring. He had served prison time, had a history of violence. Some was known to be extremely volatile. His alibi for the morning of Cheryl's disappearance was flimsy at best, and he openly admitted to having seen her walk to the bus stop, making him the last person to see her alive. However, he was open to taking a polygraph test, and he actually passed it, despite several people in the street saying they were terrified of him. The third person of interest was obviously the person who claimed to have found the body, the milk delivery driver. This man lived several counties away from the milk company, but he would end his route each day on the road where Cheryl's body was discovered. This daily proximity to her and her family would have given him ample opportunity to plan a successful kidnapping. However, there was no other evidence of his guilt. The man passed a polygraph test and was said to be emotionally devastated by the accusation. Not long after, the police ruled him out. The fourth and final person of interest was a small business owner from the same town. This man was not initially on the police radar as being involved in Cheryl's murder, but several years after, he was charged with assaulting young girls, pleading guilty in a court of law. There was local talk about him bragging about having stabbed Cheryl and putting her in the creek, but the man flatly denied those rumors as hearsay. Police did interview him, and he agreed to take a polygraph test, which he passed beyond him supposedly bragging about the murder. There was no forensic evidence to ever tie him to the crime. It should be made clear that Cheryl's dad and stepmother were never considered suspects, and her biological mother was nowhere near Kentucky during the early 70s. However, a couple of interesting facts remain. Cheryl's father said he saw his daughter leave for the bus stop at 6:25 a.m., and no one else reported having seen Cheryl out on the street, which surely would have been busy with other kids and parents out and about that morning. What's more, after Cheryl's body was found, no headstone was ever purchased for her by her immediate family. And the speaker was left town entirely just 2 months later. Cheryl's brother later said that their father never talked about Cheryl or her murder ever again. Whether this was down to guilt or simply grief, it's impossible to know. So what really happened to little Cheryl Spiegel? Was it some kind of horrible accident? Or was foul play to blame? And what exactly made all those tiny pinprick wounds that punctured the length of the breadth of her tiny body? At best, some kind of vicious predatory killer with an unusual weapon cost them. But at worst, someone or something is still out there, and it's hunting children.
When I was 18, I worked at my college's residence building at the front desk, and I think I almost got assaulted or murdered. But you be the judge of that. During the summer, the building operated as a hotel. So 2.5 floors were hotel rooms, and half of the 3rd floor were student housing. The whole building operated with a hotel swipe key system that was pretty outdated, and all the doors were powered by 4 AA batteries. If the batteries died, there was a decently lengthy process to replace them and reprogram the door. A dark-haired guy came to the front desk from inside the building while I was working an overnight shift at around 1 or 2 a.m. and said he'd left his keycard in his room. I made him a new one and made my first error of the night. Hotel guests could have as many room keys remade as they wanted, hypothetically. But students, however, were supposed to be given a temporary keycard and charged $2 to be returned when theirs is located. I gave him a new key for his room and asked if he was a student or a hotel guest, and he replied, student. At this point, I should have checked our system to charge his account, but I was caught up doing administrative duties and forgot. I used to trust people way too easily at this job, but quickly learned not to. Later on in the night, maybe around 3 or 4 a.m., he came to the desk again and said he couldn't get into his room. I asked if he'd forgotten his key again, and he said no, the door wasn't working. I asked if the light was coming on when he swiped his card, and he said no, so I figured the batteries were dead. I told him I'd have to change the batteries, and I went up to his room with him, and he asked me for my name, and I told him. But he didn't tell me his. I opened the room door manually with a master key, and told him I'd have to prop it open while I worked on the back panel to replace the batteries. No, it's okay, I'll close it, he said, and closed and deadbolted the door locked. Really weird, but I tried not to think about it. I had changed the batteries on plenty of other doors by this point, and some students were iffy about having their doors propped open for their room to be on display for anyone walking by. He also had a really thick accent, and I thought he might be an international student, since we had a lot of them from other countries where their English was not their first language. I gave him the benefit of the doubt and thought maybe it was also just a language barrier issue. At this point, though, I really felt like something was wrong, but I tried to ignore it so I didn't freak him out. While I was trying to focus on fixing the door as quickly as possible, he kept trying to entice me to go further into the room, saying his bed was broken and he needed me to take a look at it, and that there was something underneath it that needed to be fixed, etc. He held out a little gold house key and said, "I have a key, go get it," and then threw it under the bed. He said there was a leak under the fridge. He just kept trying to get me down on the ground, throwing random problems at me. Obviously, I told him no. I'd send maintenance up in the morning to take a look if anything was broken. I had my back to him, and he asked me if I would take off my glasses. I said no, I need them to see. His tone of voice changed then, and in the most steady, chilling manner he said, "Ella, it's okay, you can take them off." Then from behind me he reached around and tried to take off my glasses. I swatted his hand away, and in trying to remain composure said no thanks, I need to keep them on. Even though he was creeping me the hell out, I didn't want to be rude to him, and I didn't want to get in trouble if he'd complained about me, or risk upsetting him and having him yell at me. I got up to grab something from the door repair kit, and undid the door deadbolt and opened it up in the process. He then jumped towards the door to close it again, and told me to keep it closed. I told him no, I had to open it to start reprogramming it from the front. While I held the door open with my foot and grabbed something from the door repair kit, he started playing with the little wispy hairs at the top of my forehead and trying to touch my shoulder. I swatted him away again and asked him not to touch me, and focused on getting the hell out of there. But once again he tried to get me to follow him into the bedroom, saying the bed was broken, and I went as far as the doorframe to see if I could spot any actual problem with his bed. This is when I realized that he had nothing in his room. No dishes in the kitchen, no shower curtain in the bathroom, no sheets on the bed. Nothing. This wasn't his room. My brain once again went back to the international student theory, thinking he had just arrived today and hadn't gotten a chance to buy anything yet. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew something was wrong. I fiddled around with the door for a few more seconds before announcing that it was fixed, and quickly gathered the door kit and left. Before I had reached the elevator, he came back out with his shoes on to follow me. He tried to get back in to get his shoes and called out, "Ella, the door isn't fixed, you need to come back." I went back and opened the door manually, and told him if the door was broken I'd have to send up maintenance to fix it in the morning. I knew he was going to follow me to the elevator again, so I closed the door behind me once he'd gone inside and ran down the stairwell as fast as I could. When I got to the front desk, I checked the computer and saw that the room that he was in was supposed to be empty. It wasn't a student room or a hotel room. I locked myself in our back office and called campus security. He came down a few minutes later and went behind the desk. I yelled at him to get on the other side and wait, now that I knew he wasn't a resident. He tore the corner off a slip of paper I had sitting on the desk and drew a flower on it, then put it back on top of my papers. When security arrived, he ran back up to the empty room and tried convincing them he lived there so he wouldn't have to leave. He kept showing them his key, which had decided to work on the door again somehow, and they escorted him back downstairs and came to ask me if he really did live there. Obviously he didn't. That's why I called you guys, crying and terrified. He kept interjecting to argue that he did live there, but couldn't even recall his room number when asked. Security asked him for his student card, and he couldn't produce it, so they told him he would have to leave if he couldn't prove he lived there. While they were grabbing his information, I listened from the office and could immediately tell he was lying. The phone number he gave was just a bunch of random numbers. The name he gave was prefixed by, as if he was trying to think of a name. When they asked him for his address, he just said, across the street. One security guard asked if he lived in the apartments across the street, and he said yes, but couldn't tell them what the building number was. He said his apartment number was 1200, but I moved into that building a few months later, and apartment 1200 doesn't exist. When security asked what his purpose was to be sneaking into a room, he just kept up the ums and uhs, and saying he didn't know. They'd ask, "Were you trying to see a friend? Do you know anybody who lives here? Were you here to hurt somebody?" And he kept fidgeting and saying, "I don't know. No reason. I was just here." At one point he tried to tell them he was my friend, which is when I poked my head out of the office to say that I literally had never seen him before that night. He eventually left. We didn't call the police because he didn't actually do anything, but it was still unsettling. Later on it dawned on me how he'd figured out that that room was vacant. One of the housekeepers had been using it as her personal break room. A few days later, a housekeeper came to the desk and told me they'd found the door deadbolted open, the TV on, and a housekeeper inside watching TV. She must have forgotten to close the door when she left for the night, and when the creep let himself into the building, he found it. I never saw him again, and to this day I have no clue what he was doing there. I haven't worked there since last winter, and overnight shifts still give me the heebie-jeebies.